Unreal Engine 5. It's such a magnificent engine. Look how visually beautiful it looked back when this was revealed 4 years ago and offered amazing technological achievements. And this was all running in the PlayStation 5 base. And we all had high hopes for it to produce some amazing games with it once those developers got hold of it. Eesh. Okay, Xbox 50 FPS, it's Stalker 2. Looking a bit blurry as well. It's upscaled at 1080p. How about 40 to 50 FPS on Silent Hill 2 remake on PS5 performance mode? Lovely experience, hey? What about Immortals of Avium? One of the first UE5 games. This one did suffer from performance drops and made a huge sacrifices to get to run at close to 60 FPS. You know, you think of the upscaling, all the cuts, not great. So what's the issue of UE5? We're getting a lot of people that are complaining about it. Another great project ruined by Unreal Engine 5, Lords of the Fallen. I believe this had performance issues. People making posts in the actual UE5 forum saying please invest in actual performance, relating to all the issues with things like Nanite, and just keeps going. Nightingale, good, another UE5 game. This is a recurring issue of people having performance issues with the Unreal Engine when it comes to playing it. So is UE5 bad? Let's look into it. So just a bit of clarification, what is Unreal Engine? It's a video game engine used to make video games, and it's become very popular because it's the most high-tech one out there. Runs on C++, really good for photorealism, and it's introduced a lot of features. Also, the pricing is fantastic. If you're not making $1 million, it's free. You keep all the money yourself. If you are making a lot, then you're actually only paying a 5% royalty, and then there's obviously a seat base. So the actual cost of Unreal Engine, using it as your game, if you're a big AAA publisher and also a smaller developer, incredibly worth it. It's such a small cost. It was announced 4 years ago and has been in the public available for a good while now, maybe 3 years, I would say, perhaps, in the public. We're on version 5.5, and also a bit of clarity I want to say is that the previous Unreal Engines were also very popular. There was a lot of games made in UE4 as well, so let's just not forget that when we focus on Unreal Engine 5 as well. Just to think, oh, this new thing, but it's actually not really new, it's just a further advancement of UE4. So first of all, have I used UE5? No, I have used UE4 only a bit for a few projects, or a project, but I want to talk about what I think, and I think it coincides with more about the developers and the budget cuts, or trying to reduce your budget with this engine rather than the engine itself. Yes, the engine has problems, and the direction, as suggested in this post, is part of it, and it's also what UE5 has provided that's resulting in this sort of lower performance. I 100% think UE5 you still can get really good performance, but it's sort of pushing you into direction to go for this lower performance method rather than make a great performance game. So this was posted a few days ago, a couple of days ago, which is Bungie Legal XX reveals studio hired fans to save money because the fans would work less. And I think that's the sentiment is going around with anything Unreal Engine. Now, Destiny obviously is not made with Unreal Engine, but it gives the same vibe. And we've seen many layoffs within the industry. So just this year, 14,600 people have been estimated to be laid off within the game industry. And we can even check out 2023, because that one's also had a lot of layoffs, 10,500. We've had more layoffs this year, and in 2022, we thought 2022 was big. 2022 also had 8,500 layoffs. There's estimates suggesting that 10% of the game industry has been laid off in some way. And so do you really think that they're going to spend the money and time in improving the performance of their game when they can cut those costs as well? UE5 is arguably a very cheap engine for what it offers, rather than developing your own engine to save on that 5%. And so a lot of developers are going for it because it offers what they need, but also the cheap costs as well. So why UE5 compared to Unity or even Godot? Godot is completely free. You'd think that they'd go for Godot because it is completely free. They'd save that 5%. Well, Godot is just not as high tech as UE5. In fact, one of the short areas is in 3D, so you can't really use that. Unity had, again, not as high tech as UE5. It's not as good as producing this photorealistic effect that a lot of games are trying to capture, particularly on the Western side, but also on the Japanese game developers as well, because they also like to use it. Tekken 8 is a UE5 game, but those engines like Unity and Godot don't have things like Nanite. These are really good at cutting costs for the developers. So what does Nanite do and what is it? Essentially, you have your 3D object. Nanite will look at it and then it will create sort of levels of detail. So if you're up close, they'll load the full detailed model. And when you're really far away off, it will load a much lower detail model. This is really good, but it's just not as good as doing it the traditional way. So the traditional way is to use level of detail, also known as LODs. So when your character is very close up, you load the most high detail one, the one with the most triangles, the one that takes the most calculations, but is the one that's most details. And as your character moves far away and these objects appear further in the distance, there's no point rendering these incredibly highly detailed ones when you can just render these low ones, which actually, from a distance, you just can't tell it's too far away. So you save a lot of performance when you do this method. And this approach, the traditional approach, is far better than Nanite in a lot of cases, pretty much all cases really, because Nanite is kind of a guesstimate. It kind of guesses for you. You just give it the object and it says, hey, do it for me. It's just not as great as using the traditional LOD method, but it saves you a lot of cost. You're not having to handle it. You don't have to make these levels of details yourself. You just give it the object, it'll do it itself. And I imagine a lot of big developers are just doing that, create this model, make more models, and then just let the Nanite handle it. And we'll deal with it later, or don't deal with it. This video by Threat Interactive that goes into detail on why it's just not as a performance, is actually why it's actually an optimization disaster, because it's not helping. It's making games less optimized if you think about it, because all games previously would have done this LOD approach, but now they're choosing this sort of halfway in between, perhaps to save on costs. And it goes into great detail on how LODs work, why they're take away performance. It's not great for small shoes or any developers that may not really know better, and they're just going to assume to use Nanite because it's easier. So I guess the benefit is for some of them is that the save on costs, where costs there is actually needed to be saved, where they have essentially no money. If they're working on a solo project or their funds are very limited, there could be a Kickstarter game, then the UE5 and Nanite might help with them, save time and on budget. But your games may end up being sloppy and the code may also just be poor because you're just taking this quick approach. You're not really thinking about it. Really good to understand how the game works, how LODs works, and then you can build far more optimized and efficient games, which are very satisfying from a developer's point of view. Now that is just one issue, one that's not even really specific to UE5, but UE5 makes it really easy, is stuff like DLSS, some sort of upscaling algorithm like AMD FSR. These are fantastic. I do love these upscaling things. They create an amazing picture quality from a low resolution, and it's very performant when you think of it like that. If I want to play a game at 4K, that's very difficult to render and run because that's 4 times the amount of pixels I have to render compared to 1080p. But something like DLSS or AMD FSR are really good at getting a nice picture quality, not as good as native, yes, but for the amount of FPS and performance game is kind of worth it if you get it. However, it's getting a little bit ridiculous with many games requiring you to have DLSS or AMD FSR to play the game, especially on console, where they're beginning to sort of upscale it from 720p to 1080p, and it doesn't really work like that. DLSS really benefits from going to 4K, so 1080p, 1440p to 4K, because there's more information in the pixel. You're trying to upscale from 720p, you ain't got much information there to upscale and trying to figure out what the image is actually meant to look like, and so that's why it just looks more blurry. Things like frame generation, they show you high FPS, but this frame generation causes quite a lot of delay, like an input latency delay, which is not great. Yes, the FPS high, but you get a bit of delay. This is okay if you're already achieving over 60 FPS. So if you already have quite a fairly high, decent frame rate, then frame generation will be okay. But if you're less than 60 FPS, you have less frames, and you're trying to use frame generation, the latency will be more significant. So on top of that, what happens when you also add a nice little anti-aliasing that you're getting as well? So particularly in TAA, which is temporal anti-aliasing, and that's sort of a prediction. It tries and predicts what you're going to render the next frame. And so on a still image, so this video issues playing modding gaming graphics, which is talking about this anti-aliasing blur that's happening. So you can see in the comparison. So this left one that we have here is what it looks like when you have the camera still. and the anti-aliasing works fine. It looks great. As soon as you pan the video, it becomes a blurry mess. Look at the grates. It's like smearing Vaseline on the camera. And the reason that they're doing this is because it hides a lot of the jaggedness that in the lower quality graphics and the 3D models you have, particularly with something like hair. So hair can look pretty nasty. It's hard to create that looks good, and without anti-aliasing, it looks like quite jagged, like you see the pixels almost. So they used anti-aliasing to hide that by blurring it in to get into each other. So here, where you can see it look quite jagged, and then boom, put on the TA, yeah, it looks like you've put butter or something to blur it. It's just not look nice in my opinion. Whenever I play games, I pretty much always turn anti-aliasing on because it just looks blurry. It doesn't look great. Console's perspective, I must say, is fine if you're sitting and playing at a TV, so you're quite far back, it becomes less noticeable. But if you're playing on a PC through a monitor, you significantly notice it better. You're obviously you're much closer to the screen, so you get a clearer picture. These aren't all UE5 specific. Games can use DLSS, AMD FSR, and TA without the use of Unreal Engine. It's just Unreal Engine makes it significantly easier to use these tools as compared to other engines where you might have to program it in yourself, especially if it's an engine you make yourself. So with AMD FSR, which is open source, significantly easier to implement on Unreal Engine, it's pretty much a tick box. Yeah, it's like enable it, that's it, you're done. Which is great. Like I said, AMD FSR upscaling methods to high resolutions is where it's really, really good. But like upscaling 1080p from 720p or even 540p, which is the resolution of like a GameCube game. Just think about that. If you're trying to upscale it to that, there's not enough information there to make it look great. It'll look pretty blurry, in which we can see in the console games, stuff like Stalker 2. You actually look closely, you can see it's just a bit of a blurry mess. But it's good for more lower end hardware. So something like the Steam Deck, for example, it's not, nothing's being built for the Steam Deck in particular. It's just a handheld sort of PC, so you can run PC games. That's where AMD FSR is great for getting that like 720p resolution from a 460p. You're not going extremely high, but it's great for those really demanding games to be actually playable. It's better than it not being playable. But there is obviously a difference from designing a game for a console to be upscaled to 1080p rather than making a game run on 1080p native first. That's what I think. I think 1080p 60 FPS should be really the standard. 30 FPS I think is understandable for certain games. Something like Grand Theft Auto, I imagine GTA 6 will be a 30 FPS game, and trying to get the 60 FPS, I can imagine the cuts that they'll have to features perhaps. I also want to remind us that it wasn't that long ago that companies were using their own engine or developing their own engine for their games, and it was pretty disastrous for quite a few companies. CD Projekt Red with Cyberpunk, the game took 8 years since it was first announced, and it launched horribly. The performance was terrible. Many features were cut out because they could not figure out how to implement them at the time. So this one was the offer apology because this game was so hyped. I feel like I don't even have to remind you. We all know what happened to CD Projekt Red with this game. Basically couldn't run on PS4. I imagine, and then in the demos that they had, where they were driving very slow because it obviously would have caused huge frame dips. Yeah, and I had this on PC. If you didn't have the highest end graphics card, the highest end CPU, the performance would not be too good. So what played it was because, well, they were developing game, but they also had to develop the engine alongside it. Red Engine was built for the Witcher game, which is a third-person sword fighting RPG game. Cyberpunk is an RPG shooter game in first person with driving physics, something that the Witcher obviously did not have. So you can imagine all the features that they had to work on the engine to get it to work. So did Cyberpunk really take 8 years to make, or was it more like 4 years was spent actually making the game, so working on it, and then 4 years spent on just updating the engine so they could make the game? Another one was Halo Infinite. This had huge issues at launch. It's good now, but it took a long time. So this was a classic moment. Halo Infinite mode. Its November release date, which was the Forge, should be a core feature of the game, should be there at launch, was not there at launch. It took forever to add it. Split screen was also a core feature of the game, was not there, and they in fact cancelled it because they couldn't figure out it had performance issues. This should have been found way before the start, whether it should have been added or not. And a lot of this issue was because of the engine, and Also, a big one was that they took out a lot of contract work. They got a bunch of people to work on a game, but once their contract ended, they were out. They didn't have many developers left to actually just work on the game. And so these features took so long to add is because they're not just working on the game, they're working on the engine itself. And so this is one of the big disadvantages of trying to use an engine, that if that engine does not support that feature takes an incredibly long time to implement. And with all the layoffs that happen, they're not going to be hiring people to then pay them to train them, because this is a proprietary engine, so it's not available in the public, so no one knows outside of the company how it works, so you have to train them. With Unreal Engine, that is a public engine that's available for everyone to use, very popular engine, so hiring becomes significantly easier because you just have to check, have experience with Unreal Engine, you can hire them, they're going to be working on the game much quicker. Some companies are obviously holding on to their engine, which is a good thing, it's been a success, and with Bethesda, after Starfield, a lot of people saying that the engine is holding them back, and to some extent that is true, but switching to something Unreal Engine would also hold them back even more, because think of how specific Starfield, Skyrim, those games are. There really isn't a game that's just like it, with the persistent worlds. So with Starfield, you can knock over a piece of item, travel to a whole different planet, come back to that specific area, and it will still be knocked down in that same position. Something like Unreal Engine would not have that feature, so they'd have to implement that feature, whether even the engine itself supports it, because Unreal Engine is more of a general purpose engine. It kind of covers a wide topic. Creation Engine is a very specific engine focused on procedural generation, RPG, and a dialogue system, stuff like that. I definitely don't think they should drop the engine because it's so specific to their needs in their games. The UE5 definitely won't fix that. It would again slow them down. Unfortunately, the rate at which their games will come out will obviously be significantly slower because they've got to update the engine, maintain the engine for those games. There's stuff like Elder Scrolls 6, Fallout 5, they're going to take a long time, I think. Starfield did take a long time as well because they had never made a game like that. So to update and implement all the features for the next generation, Creation Engine 2, was quite difficult. Many companies have laid off employees. They're not going to be wanting to hiring a whole team to develop their own engine or continue developing their own engine when UE5 is perfect for what their game requires and offers features that makes them develop these games faster while retaining a visually high quality. Upscalers like AMD FSR and DLSS are unfortunately being abused, meaning you have to have them on to get a good performance for your game, which is not how it should be. I would compare upscalers to like a supplement. You have your healthy diet, but then you supplement it with some vitamins. That's what those upscalers should be. You have your game, you can then supplement with your upscaler to get 4K or high FPS, especially if you're on older hardware. Not being that in order to get a good frame rate, you have to run the upscaler. I unfortunately think that this will just continue, because either the game is successful and then they just fix it later on, or the game is just unsuccessful and then they don't update it. Also, is there some sort of forgiveness as well? Stalker 2 is made by a much smaller development team, but yet it looks like a AAA game, and kind of is a AAA game when you look at it, but it just doesn't perform as well. But UE5 enables that. They can do these nice, very high detailed games, add all these features that they wouldn't have been able to without this engine. So there is some thought put into it. Of course, we had the PS5 Pro, which has its own upscaler, the PISA as well. That's what it's abbreviated to. And it's just going to get worse, I think. And what I think is funny is this next part that comes up, high frame rates, 120 FPS. I've not seen a single game on the PS5 Pro that is running at 120 FPS, because it still requires the developers. In fact, feature only available for select PS5 games. So if we go back to that one, because the developers have to work on these features, and of the games that are available in the performance and quality mode, they're just not up to scratch for how much the console costs. So unless Sony starts paying these developers to enhance their games for this feature, then I don't expect it, because if they're not going to make it run well on the base PS5 because they want to have nice visuals and cut all those costs, why are they going to spend the time to hey, let's see if we can get 120 FPS on this game that doesn't even run 160 FPS on the base PS5 model? Because actually, when you compare the specs, I think the CPU is very, very similar to the PS5 Pro, which is held back in quite a few games. So I think that's enough ranting. Do I think UE5 is bad? No. I think in the hands of a very good developer, it's going to be very good. It offers a lot of features that are actually useful, and make nice photorealistic games. But a lot of the features that they've had at Nanite, the upscaler, which is not necessarily UE5's fault, it's of course AMD and Nvidia, and these are actual good features in the right hands, but they obviously can be used to cut costs and corners. It's pretty funny looking back at the demo when we were amazed by it when these first announced UE5 and it was running on a base PS5. It looked amazing and was running amazing, but now when we look at it, the games have come out. Yeah, they've run on it. They don't run well. They look like a blurry mess and are upscaled like crazy. But what do you think of UE5? Do you like it? Have you worked with it? And do you think it's going to get better, or do you think the games are going to get worse? And so I will direct you to my channel where I cover other topics like this, or some actual programming stuff, some algorithms like collision detection that are made using your own code rather than just using whatever's built in a game engine. And I hope to see you in some of those videos. So I'll see you till then.